Let's bring Rich Rubino in now. He's a political analyst and historian. Thank you so much for being with us, Rich.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So we hear so much about Kissinger's influence in foreign policy, and that's tied to world economies. I think two words that really sum this up are complex, controversial as far as this man's legacy. What was his impact in shaping American and global economic policy?
Well, essentially, and you're right, and the reason Henry Kissinger is seen so controversial is essentially for him, it was a zero-sum game. Everything was about the Soviet Union and the United States. So consequently, countries like whether it was happening in Indonesia, whether it was the coup in Chile, Argentina, were seen almost as subservient in terms of human rights, for example. So essentially, from an economic standpoint, in terms of China, in terms of Russia, the major countries, everything was about economics and everything was about the economies of both countries. And that's why, for example, many in the geopolitical world, many certainly diplomats, for example, are very praiseful, very laudatory of him for his indefatigable efforts, for example, in the Middle East. But many on the left and many in the human rights community on the other side say that he essentially ignored human rights concerns, and that's why he's such a controversial figure. That's why on the one hand, you have people that absolutely think he's a genius and everything else, and the other side, you have people that essentially say that he's a war criminal. There's very little kind of in between there.
And I think that it's fair to say there are many continued tensions with those two countries that you're talking about. And some of his critics say that by opening up trade and investment in China, he kind of inadvertently led to China being this huge economic powerhouse that we're seeing today. So what kind of drove his decision making? What was his political ideology that led to that? And do you think that he could foresee what was coming down here as far as maybe an unintended consequence?
I think his ideology is very much different than, say, President George W. Bush that said the ultimate end should be ending tyranny in the world, or Joe Biden that talked about how democracies need to beat out autocracies. For him, it was all realpolitik, meaning essentially that it does not matter what type of a system the government of another country has. It's all essentially about what kind of relations we can have with them and what we can do for them, what they can do for us, transactional. And he saw a kind of a split there, the Sino-Soviet split with the Soviet Union. Even though the Soviet Union and China were both communists, they both had separate interests. So he said essentially, and he was making some secret trips, some shuttles. I guess you could call it shuttle diplomacy to a certain degree with China. And eventually, President Nixon landed up meeting with Mao Zedong. And eventually, Jimmy Carter in 1979 decided that we should have normalization of relations with China. Later on, Bill Clinton in 2000 worked assiduously his last year in office to get China into the World Trade Organization and to give them most favored nation status. And that's one of the arguments that many critics have in terms of our current relationship with China. They say that China kind of took advantage of it, that we shouldn't have kind of let him into the world community, if you will. But that was really the beginning of the process. We kind of brought China into the world community, and they really had an alliance with the United States. And later, actually, President Ford with Henry Kissinger actually visited China as well. And Henry Kissinger certainly later in his life, to the point that when he was literally in his 90s, was making sojourns to the nation.
Yeah, really unbelievable how long he continued that international travel. I mean, how much credit do you think he deserves in China's in securing China's current economic standing?
I don't know how much actually in terms of their economic standing you can actually attribute directly to Henry Kissinger and the Nixon administration, because the United States and China, while that's certainly an elephantine relationship, that is not. China certainly has trade agreements with many other countries. They certainly domestically, their own consumption, for example, has a lot to do with it. But certainly, what I could say is he kind of made a breakthrough when many thought that President Nixon specifically, because he was an ardent anti-communist. When he ran for United States Senate in 1950, he called his opponent, Helen Hagen Douglas, the Red Lady. But it was really, that's why they say this term, the Nixon going to China moment. When President Nixon actually went to China, he basically showed even the most conservative members of the Republican Party that if someone that was so anti-communist as Richard Nixon would go to China, that yes, we have to deal with China. But I think in terms of the actual economic impact, I think you can really overstate that.
Okay, political analyst and historian Rich Rubino, thank you so much for your insight on Henry Kissinger's legacy. And still ahead on Scripps News, Carolyn, I'll